For some time, I had been meaning to explore the country around the Continental Divide accessible via the I-15 exits at Spencer or Du Bois. The first such expedition came to fruition when an old friend of mine, Mason by name, dropped by on his motorcycle while passing through Idaho on a cross-country road trip. He had planned to spend a couple of days in Idaho, so I suggested we go camping, and the I-15 access to the Continental Divide region afforded a reasonably close destination. We took the Du Bois exit, found our way to the Medicine Lodge Road, and followed it to the Irving Creek turnoff, after which we made our way to the end of a forest road that terminated at the foot of Red Conglomerate Peak. It was already late afternoon by the time we arrived, and so, after setting up camp, we immediately set about building a fire to prepare supper. No sooner had we started the fire, however, than an afternoon thundershower came through. We built up the fire and managed to keep it going through the hour or two of drizzling rain that followed, but didn't attempt to do any cooking until after it had passed. When, at long last, the drizzle did subside, we grilled hamburgers over the fire and garnished them with wild chive blossoms that we found growing near our campsite. Much to our pyrotechnic amusement, we discovered that when a hamburger patty is pressed against a hot griddle suspended over a campfire, fats contained in the hamburger meat volatilize and are ignited by the flames of the campfire, creating a vigorous flare above the griddle. In addition to the aesthetic excitement that such flames add to the cooking experience, it seems that radiant heat from the flare helps to brown the top side of the patty, accelerating cooking and producing a hamburger with a nicely browned exterior. By the time we finished dinner, it was well after dark, and another storm system seemed to be moving in, so we retired to our tents. The following morning dawned bright and clear, and as the sun rose, streamers of mist began rolling off the dew-sodden sagebrush. After breakfasting on bacon and French toast fried over the campfire, Mason and I headed up the thickly treed slope behind our camp to see if we could conquer the summit of Red Conglomerate Peak. The mountain didn't look all that big, and we figured we could summit it in a few hours, but we packed a lunch just in case. We didn't bring any rain gear, as the sky was beautifully clear, and we would be back in camp long before the day's heat brewed up any afternoon thundershowers. The first 3 or 4 hours of our hike consisted of a grueling climb up the steep lower slopes of the mountain. In most places, the ground sloped upwards at greater than a 45-degree angle, and we were frequently faced with insurmountable vertical cliffs that forced us to backtrack and find another way around. By noon, we seemed to have gotten past the steepest part and were making our way through a dense forest of fir trees on the upper slopes of the mountain. A dark mass of clouds had been gathering over the mountains to the north for the past hour or two, accompanied by ominous rumblings of thunder. A drizzle of rain began to fall not long after we reached the forest. Noting that we appeared to be right on the edge of the storm system and that the wind was favorable, we decided to take shelter under the thick boughs of the fir trees and wait for the rain to pass over before moving on. We waited for perhaps 15 minutes, and were just about ready to press on through the subsiding drizzle when the wind suddenly shifted 180 degrees. Within minutes, the rain intensified from a drizzle to a deluge of sleet, and then to corn snow and pea-sized hail that pelted the land in furious white sheets. Within the space of 5 minutes, the storm dumped nearly an inch of pelletized ice on the ground, after which its fury gradually subsided and blue sky began to appear overhead. Both Mason and I were by this time thoroughly drenched and seriously chilled. Well aware of the dangers of hypothermia, we managed to pull apart a fallen log, and, using dry wood from the interior of the log, we got a fire going. Scarcely had we done so, it seemed, than the wind again shifted 180 degrees, and the storm clouds began to move ominously back in our direction. We built up the fire and huddled over it as the storm pelted us again with rain and sleet and ice. Yet the brunt of its fury seemed to have been spent on the first pass, and presently the weather cleared entirely. We tarried for some time around the fire, drying our drenched outer garments and eating the lunch we had packed. Eventually, when the fire had burned itself out, we continued on up the mountain, carefully treading on the corn snow and hoping the ice would have melted off the lower slopes before we had to descend them. The trek up the upper slopes of Red Conglomerate Peak proved much longer and more difficult than expected. It soon became apparent that what we had seen from the valley below was not the entirety of the peak, but rather just a spur of it that happened to loom over our chosen camping spot. Several times we emerged onto what we thought would be the summit, only to find that it was but a rocky prominence on a slope that continued upwards. Finally, we emerged onto yet another prominence and found our ridge cleft by sheer cliffs that fell away several hundred feet. There might have been a path around them to the left, but the afternoon was already wearing on into evening, and so we decided to call this our summit and turn back, though not before taking a few pictures of the breathtaking scenery visible from the height of the prominence. By the time we reached the lower slopes of the mountain, most of the ice had indeed melted off. Opting to take a slightly different way down, we half climbed, half slid down a steep chute of mostly loose rock into a ravine, which we were then able to follow back to camp. Down in the ravine, under the protective shade of the trees, there was yet an inch of ice on the ground, or more in places. When we got back to camp, Mason discovered that his tent had collapsed and was literally buried under about 150 pounds of ice pellets. It seemed odd that while the corn snow was scarcely more than an inch deep in most places, it had piled up to a depth of nearly a foot on top of Mason's tent. My own tent, only 10 yards away, and consisting merely of a tarp thrown over a makeshift frame in the back of my truck, had fared quite well, being covered with pulverized pine twigs that the storm had stripped from the trees, but otherwise unaffected. Between us, we picked up Mason's rainfly and dumped the ice off in a pile. He then picked up the tent itself and drained a couple gallons of icy water that had collected in it. We strung a stout rope between two trees, maybe 60 feet apart, at a height of about 10 feet, and Mason draped his tent and its contents over the line to dry out, while I went off to collect more wild chive blossoms to garnish our burgers that night. Thinking to make the best of the situation, we used the pile of ice that we had dumped off of Mason's tent to chill some sodas that would complement our dinner. Fortunately, the sunny weather held all evening, accompanied by intermittent breezes, and so Mason was able to dry his stuff adequately before dark. He re-erected the tent on an ice-free patch of ground, and we turned in shortly after sunset, before the corn-snow-chilled breezes could bring the ambient temperature down to freezing. When we arose the next morning, the remaining corn snow was crusty underfoot, indicating that it had indeed frozen during the night, although there was no frost to be seen. We cooked bacon and chive blossom omelets over the campfire for breakfast, and then broke camp and hit the road, concluding a successful and eventful expedition.